Hello and welcome back to Learn Linux TV. Recently, I uploaded a video that was all about OpenStack. In that video, I gave you an introduction to OpenStack as well as some tips on how to get started with it. And you guys seemed to like that video quite a bit. In fact, you asked me for more OpenStack content on this channel, and you should be very careful what you wish for because you just might get it. And actually, you are going to get more OpenStack content on this channel, and that starts with this video right here. This is the first video in a 6-part tutorial series that covers OpenStack. And as we go through this series, I'll add additional concepts in each video to give you a well-rounded understanding of how to manage OpenStack. With this particular video, this is episode number 1 of the series, and what I'm going to do in this episode is give you an overview of the series, and I'll also cover administration topics as well. And as we go through this series, I'll add additional concepts in each video to give you a well-rounded understanding of how to manage OpenStack. For example, in the second episode, it's all about compute. I'll show you how to set up virtual machines, take snapshots, we'll talk about images. It's going to be a lot of fun. In episode number 3, it's all about storage. Storage is definitely an important layer within your OpenStack infrastructure, and actually, storage is critical for any data center, regardless of the technology that you use, but it's really important to understand storage, so we're definitely going to cover that within the series. Continuing with episode number 4, we're going to dive into one of my personal favorite subjects, networking. In that episode, we'll look at security groups, routing, floating IPs, and more. When it comes to episode number 5, that episode is going to be all about OpenShift. Yes, OpenShift is technically a separate project from OpenStack, but deploying a solution such as OpenShift is a great way to get some hands-on experience working with OpenStack. In fact, OpenStack and OpenShift work quite well together. Since that video will utilize various concepts that you would have learned through the series up to that point, it'll not only reinforce your OpenStack knowledge, but it'll also serve as an introduction to OpenShift on this channel. And that's definitely an episode you won't want to miss. With the 6th and final episode in the series, we're going to explore automation. Automation will enable you to leverage the OpenStack CLI, as well as technologies such as Terraform and Ansible. This means that by the end of the series, you'll not only learn OpenStack, but you'll also get some hands-on experience with how these various resources work together. Now, I bet a lot of you are wondering at this point what exactly you need to get started. What hardware might you need, and what about software? What do you need for software? Well, the short answer is when it comes to this particular course, you don't really need anything. You could simply take notes as you watch each episode, and in that case, you wouldn't need anything at all. But if you do want to follow along with me as I dive into OpenStack, then what you'll need is an OpenStack instance of your own. For most of you, setting up OpenStack in a VM is probably the easiest way to build a reference installation for the topics that we're going to cover. Another option is to use a spare server if you happen to have one. Now, in the overview video that I've uploaded previously, which I'll leave a card for right about here, in that video, I already gave you guys an overview of what you might need in order to get started with a reference installation for OpenStack. There's several different options available, and there's no wrong option when it comes to setting up an OpenStack reference installation, but I'll leave that part up to you. I definitely recommend you check out that original video that I've uploaded. In fact, I actually consider that to be episode 0 of this series, and I'm even going to put it in the same playlist as the other episodes in this series. Now, in order to save you some time, if you do want to set up a reference installation of your own, then I'm going to summarize the requirements right now. If you plan on setting up OpenStack in a virtual machine or even on a physical server, then I recommend you have at least 64 gigabytes of memory. You could probably get away with less, but I think 64 gigabytes is going to be the most comfortable minimum when it comes to building a reference installation. When it comes to CPUs, I definitely recommend at least one multi-core processor, and preferably 2 if you have access to set up a physical server with more than one CPU. But if nothing else, if you set up a virtual machine with as many cores as you possibly can that fits within your hardware constraints, then that should be good enough. When it comes to storage, I recommend over 100 gigabytes of storage as a minimum, but keep in mind, depending on how many images and virtual machines you plan on setting up within OpenStack, that'll determine exactly how much storage you might need. So for that reason, it's really hard for me to give you an exact number. But my recommendation in general is to use whatever storage you have available, and if you have access to a solid-state drive, well, that's going to be a lot faster than a spinning Rust hard drive, so that's going to give you a better experience. But all things considered, when it comes to learning, I always recommend you just use whatever you have available. Just go ahead and try it out and see what happens. If anything goes wrong, you could always erase everything and start over. So either you can simply follow along and take notes as we go through each and every lesson, or you could follow along with me if you have access to set up a VM or if you have access to a physical server. If you plan on setting up a reference installation, then go ahead and get that done, and then we'll continue as soon as you're ready. Now, I'm very eager to get started with today's lesson, but before I do, I want to mention the sponsor for today's video, and that sponsor is OpenMetal. OpenMetal has provided me with the reference installation that I'll be using as I go through the concepts in this series. But perhaps I'm getting ahead of myself. If you haven't already heard of OpenMetal yet, they're a company that absolutely loves OpenStack. If you want to check them out, feel free to visit the URL that you see on the screen right now. I recommend that you do because OpenMetal is all about OpenStack. Another thing that I enjoy about OpenMetal is that part of their mission is to increase OpenStack adoption within the entire community. And they don't just say that they love OpenStack, they use it internally. In fact, both OpenStack and Ceph are technologies that are core to their business. So definitely check out OpenMetal for an awesome OpenStack experience. It just doesn't get any better than being set up with OpenStack by a company that adores the technology. If this is something that interests you, then definitely check out OpenMetal. You'll not only be set up with your very own OpenStack cloud, but you'll also support Learn Linux TV, which is a win-win. So thank you very much to OpenMetal for sponsoring this series. I really appreciate it. So let's go ahead and get started. I'm excited to dive into OpenStack, and the best way to experience OpenStack is to see it in action. So let's go ahead and dive in and learn OpenStack. So on the screen right now, what you're seeing is the actual login screen for OpenStack. So what I'll do is just log in. I'll paste in the password right here, and we'll sign in. And now what we see right here on the screen is the dashboard for OpenStack. But this isn't just any dashboard though. What you're seeing is known as Horizon. And Horizon is the component of OpenStack that provides the dashboard that you see right here. Now it might seem strange at first that the dashboard has a name, but actually each of OpenStack's services have their own name as well as a specific goal that they solve that collectively provides the entire OpenStack solution. And you could think of OpenStack services as individual projects. In fact, that's exactly what they are. Okay, well, hold on a minute. We've just got started with the series and I'm already talking about a bunch of different components and services, and this is just the introduction video? Well, don't worry about that. There's a very important reason why I'm mentioning that so early in the series, because it's something that I want you guys to understand as we go through the series, because the thing is, OpenStack is the sum of all of its parts. I'm going to repeat that. OpenStack is the sum of all of its parts. So as we go through this particular series, I'll be introducing additional concepts and components within OpenStack, but just keep in mind, again, OpenStack is the sum of all of its parts. But wouldn't it be better if OpenStack was just one thing? I mean, why are there so many components? Why isn't OpenStack just one turnkey solution? Wouldn't that be better? Well, in my opinion, no. By having each component being separate, that gives us many more options when it comes to scaling our OpenStack cloud. As our organization grows and our OpenStack implementation grows, we can add additional servers as we go along and expand the overall solution and grow it as we need. And that gives us additional power that other solutions, well, just doesn't provide you with. Which also means your cost of entry is a lot lower than it might be with other solutions. However, right now, you're probably just learning OpenStack and you might not have a bunch of servers or even a few servers to use for scaling out OpenStack. When it comes to learning OpenStack, having everything on one server is okay. You can absolutely do that. Right now, we just have our single instance, but if we wanted to, we could always grow it in the future. But again, for those of you that are learning, well, you probably just have one server or one virtual machine. And even though a single server installation isn't necessarily how you would set up OpenStack in production, it's absolutely fine when it comes to learning. So at this point, what you now understand, if you didn't already know, is that OpenStack is made up of individual projects that work together to form one solution. And we now know of one solution right here, the dashboard, Horizon. And again, Horizon is what you see right here. It's the dashboard. It allows us to manage our OpenStack installation. And this dashboard not only gives us an overview of our entire OpenStack implementation, it allows us to manage it as well. And in this video, we're going to be spending quite a bit of time right here in Horizon. Anyway, what I'm going to do right now is give you an overview of Horizon and some of the noteworthy sections that you see right here in the dashboard. I'll be going over each of the components that you see here in more detail later on, but for right now, I think an overview is probably best. So right here, I'm in the Compute section. That was actually the section that I was looking at before I logged out, so when I logged in again, it took me right back to the place where I was last time. However, we can already see some interesting details here. For example, we have all of these pie charts. And we also have a usage summary. But what exactly does compute refer to? Well, when it comes to compute resources, we're referring to virtual machine resources. So if you've already set up a virtual machine in another solution, you might even be running OpenStack itself in a virtual machine when it comes to learning and testing. And actually, it's not really all that different here when it comes to what compute refers to, virtual machines. Now, it's possible that your OpenStack installation that you're using for learning might even be running in a virtual machine. And that concept is not all that different here in OpenStack. Within the compute section, that's what we do. We build virtual machines. We have a section here for instances, and that'll show us the individual instances or compute instances that we have here within our cloud. We also have an images section. And as you can see, we have images for various Linux distributions, such as CentOS, Debian, and so on. And that's something that we'll be exploring in more detail in the next episode. We also have key pairs. I have a key right here. So if you're familiar with SSH, then you probably already know what this refers to. SSH keys are something that I've covered on this channel before. And you know what? I'll leave a card for that video right about here. If you've never connected to a server via SSH before, then I have a quick walkthrough on that process, and I'll leave a card for that video right about here. In addition to that, I also have an in-depth guide to SSH that goes over basically everything you need to know about SSH, and I'll leave a card for that video right about here. But a quick summary for those of you that might not be aware of what an SSH key is, using an SSH key or an SSH key pair, that's a more secure method of connecting to a server via SSH. In fact, you'll see the process of connecting to an OpenStack compute instance via SSH in the next episode. Now, an alternative to an SSH key is password authentication for SSH, which is not something that you want to use in production. And in fact, password authentication is the default when it comes to SSH. Again, keys are better. Having an SSH key pair set up will allow you to connect to your servers more securely. And again, we'll see that process in the next episode. But if that's a new concept for you, then you'll definitely understand it in the next episode, so I wouldn't worry about it so much right now. Next, we have server groups. When it comes to server groups, we'll be exploring that in a future episode. But basically what this means is that you can ensure that certain compute instances are running on the same node or the same underlying hardware. If you have multiple OpenStack servers, for example, as you would in production, then you might want to ensure that a compute instance is running on a particular underlying piece of hardware. Maybe you might want a compute instance running on one piece of hardware and a mirror of that instance on another, and you want to make sure that they're not running on the same server. Or maybe you want to ensure that your compute instances are running on the same server because latency is something that's critical to your operation or to the purpose for those VMs. If that's the case, you might want to create rules as far as which server each particular compute instance will start on. Now, in this series, we'll only be working with one instance. However, I will be explaining this in more detail in a future episode. Now, let's move on to the volume section. And what a volume actually refers to is a virtual hard disk. Currently, I have 2 compute instances running on this particular OpenStack cloud. We can see the randomly generated name for the volumes right here, and we could also see which compute instance each one of these is attached to. So again, you could think of these as virtual hard disks. If you create a VM or a compute instance, then you're going to need a hard disk or a virtual disk for the operating system, and once you create that instance, then you'll see the disk listed right here. We also have a backup section here. And I think that's fairly self-explanatory. Backups are very, very important, something that you should always be doing. Moving on, we also have a subsection here for snapshots. I've already created one right here. I wanted to make sure that an Apache upgrade wasn't going to break anything. So what I did was I created a snapshot of one of the compute instances here in this particular OpenStack cloud. I tested the changes, and I created this snapshot in case something went wrong, I could always go back to the original state of that particular instance as if nothing happened. So if you're already familiar with the concept of snapshots when it comes to virtual machines, then well, it's pretty much the same thing here. Continuing from here, we have groups. And this actually gives us the ability to group volumes together, and we could also group snapshots together as well. We'll be covering storage in episode 3, so I wouldn't worry about that so much right now, but I just wanted you to be aware that these subsections exist here in Horizon. Now I'm going to skip over container infrastructure for now. Just go ahead and minimize this, and let's just skip ahead to the admin section. If I click on Overview right here, we can see some resource usage information. So you can see this particular project has 5 virtual CPUs, 41 gigabytes when it comes to disk, 5 gigabytes of RAM, and so on. Again, we'll be covering that in more detail later on, but it might be useful to get an overview when you want to see whether or not there's any resource contention. And again, if there is resource contention, that's a good indication that you might need to scale your OpenStack solution, and that's something that OpenStack facilitates quite well. We also have a compute section here underneath admin, which is interesting because we already had that underneath project and compute. We have a compute section here, but we also have a compute section here underneath admin. In fact, if I click right here, I have a list of the instances on this particular cloud. As you can see, I have this one right here and this one right here. But the difference here in the admin section is that we can configure how our compute resources are handled. So I'll just go ahead and make this a bit larger here. There's a little bit of line wrapping. We have flavors right here, for example, and flavors are going to give us a preset selection when it comes to how much RAM, how much disk, and how many CPUs are available to an instance. When we create a compute instance, which we will be doing in the next episode, then we could choose one of these types right here as the base flavor for the instance. So for example, if you had a use case that was fairly lightweight, then you might actually want to go with a micro instance, which is actually going to utilize fewer resources, or a large or extra large instance as needed depending on the use case for your compute instance. Continuing, underneath the admin section, we also have an images section. And what these images allow us to do is create a compute instance that's based around a specific Linux distribution. So let's say, for example, you wanted to create an Ubuntu 2004 instance. When we go to launch an instance, which again we will be doing in the next episode, in that case you might want to choose Ubuntu 2004 if that's the distribution that you want to go with for your particular use case. Or perhaps maybe you'll go with Debian or CentOS. These images right here being available to us makes the distribution that you see on the list available to us when we create an instance. We'll also see snapshots here as well when we get to that point, but for right now, you could think of these as deployment images for specific Linux distributions because that's exactly what they are. Now another section that I want to show you, and I know I'm going a bit out of order, but I wanted to definitely make sure that I give you some information around project. We also have a section here for API access. And what API access allows us to do is programmatically configure our OpenStack cloud from the command line or from another tool. Later in the series, we will be configuring API access for things like Ansible and Terraform. If we wanted to view credentials, for example, we could click right here, and then we could view the API credentials for this particular project. Again, that allows us to programmatically adjust, edit, and tweak, and even build resources here within our OpenStack cloud. Now, another section that I want to make sure that we cover, or at least get an overview of, is the identity section. And the first subsection that we have within identity is projects. In fact, we already have a few projects right here. And down here, we have a project called admin. And this is the default project for my OpenStack cloud, but you might be wondering what exactly a project refers to in context of OpenStack. Well, basically what a project is a grouping of user resources. If you have multiple users that are going to be using your OpenStack cloud, then you might want to group those users by a particular category. For example, maybe you have a team of database administrators, and you might want to give them access to the database servers, but if they don't actually manage other Linux instances, then it wouldn't make sense to give them access to everything. You could group their access into a project and then make sure that the users within that project are added to the project here on OpenStack, and then you could fine-tune the permissions for those particular users. Maybe your team, the IT team or DevOps team, or whatever it might be called, perhaps you'll have a project that has even more access. Now that is something we'll take a look at in more detail later on, but for right now, just keep in mind that with projects, you can actually group users into logical groups of permissions and settings. But for now, just keep in mind that you can configure projects to group your users and fine-tune their access. And speaking of users, we have a section right here for users, so I'll click on that. And we have all kinds of users created here on this particular cloud. Now I'm logged in as admin, as you can see right here, and here's the admin user. That's the first user that we have here within the OpenStack cloud. Now these users here are not actually people. What you're seeing is actually the names of some of the other projects within OpenStack. Earlier I mentioned that OpenStack is the sum of all of its parts, and I also mentioned that Horizon is the name of the project that provides us with the dashboard that we're seeing right here. We also have projects such as Glance, Cinder, Nova, Neutron, and so on. I'm not going to get into any detail yet about what those particular projects are, but we will be actually looking at those in greater detail later on, so as not to confuse you. The takeaway right now is that, again, OpenStack is the sum of all of its parts. There's different projects or services within OpenStack that give us the entire solution, and what we're seeing here are system users for those particular projects. Now we also have a section for application credentials right here, and that might sound familiar because I just mentioned application credentials as I went through the other section. Well, that section was for managing the API credentials or application credentials, but we didn't see a button there for creating application credentials. But right here, I can absolutely do that by clicking the button that reads Create Application Credential. We can give it a name. We could configure the expiration date if we want one, the roles that that particular credential will have access to, access rules, and so on. Now again, we'll be covering that later on, but I wanted you to be aware of where you would go in the interface to create an application credential if you needed to do so. And actually, I'm going to stop this particular episode right about here. I wanted to give you guys an overview of the administration concepts around OpenStack, and we'll be going into greater detail when it comes to those concepts later on, but for right now, I thought it was important to give you guys a summary. Now, before you move on to the next episode, I recommend that you just click around the interface. Just take a look at the individual sections that you have access to, and make sure that you learn Horizon or have a general idea of where things are. Now, the next episode will be uploaded very soon if it isn't already, and as soon as you're ready to move on, I will meet you in the next episode. In the meantime, though, thank you so much for watching this episode right here. I really appreciate it, and I'll see you again very soon.